In the heart of bustling cities, the remnants of empires past linger, casting long shadows over modernity. These echoes are not just in the architecture, but in the very fabric of society, influencing cultures, languages, and traditions. Yet, as we walk these streets, do we truly understand the legacy left behind? Introduction: The Echo of Empire. On a storm-racked island in the South Atlantic, an emperor died in exile. The date was May 5th, 1821, and Napoleon Bonaparte's last coherent words drifted through the damp air of Longwood House. France, armée, tête d'armée, Joséphine. Even in death, his thoughts turned to the twin poles of his existence, military glory and lost love. The British guards outside his window, who had watched over him for 6 years on St. Helena, could finally relax their vigilance. The man who had reshaped Europe through sheer force of will had left the stage. 200 years later, Napoleon's presence still looms over our world like a colossus. His fingerprints are everywhere, in the legal codes of dozens of nations, in the borders of modern Europe, in the very concept of meritocracy that defines our age. Walk the streets of Paris, and you'll find his imprint in every triumph arch, every perfectly planned boulevard, every administrative district. Even the food we eat bears his mark. The humble canned goods that stock our pantries were invented to feed his armies on their march to Moscow. But why another book about Napoleon? Haven't forests already fallen to feed our endless fascination with this singular figure? The answer lies not in discovering new facts, though archives still occasionally yield surprising treasures, but in understanding how a single human being could bend history to his will through a combination of genius, ambition, and flaws that were sometimes indistinguishable from his talents. Consider the paradoxes. A Corsican outsider who became more French than the French. A child of the revolution who strangled that same revolution in its cradle. A military genius who ultimately destroyed the army he loved through his own hubris. A rational modernizer who couldn't resist the pull of ancient dynasty. A man who could reorganize entire nations but never fully master his own impulses. This is not just the story of a general or an emperor or a conqueror. This is the story of how the modern world was forged in the crucible of one man's overwhelming ambition. Napoleon's life reads like fiction. The young artillery officer who rose from obscurity to command armies, crown himself emperor, marry a princess, and very nearly create a unified Europe through a combination of military genius and administrative brilliance. Then, like Icarus flying too close to the sun, he fell, leaving an altered world in his wake. In the pages that follow, we'll meet Napoleon not as the marble bust of legend, but as a living, breathing human being of extraordinary, and sometimes terrible, capabilities. We'll see him as his contemporaries did, charismatic and maddening, brilliant and reckless, inspiring and terrifying. Through their eyes, friends, enemies, lovers, and victims, we'll witness the rise and fall of a man who, perhaps more than any other individual in history, showed both the heights that human ambition could reach and the devastating price of that ambition. This is a story of power, how it's gained, how it's wielded, and how it destroys. It's a story of revolution, both the kind that topples governments and the kind that transforms societies. Most of all, it's a story about human nature, about how our greatest strengths often contain the seeds of our destruction, and how the very qualities that allow us to achieve greatness can ultimately bring about our downfall. The tale begins not in France, but on a rugged Mediterranean island, where a young boy named Napoleon Bonaparte first learned the lessons that would shape his character. Lessons about power, about being an outsider, about the need to dominate or be dominated. From those rocky shores would emerge a force of nature that would reshape a continent and leave an indelible mark on human history. Let us begin. Introduction: The Echo of Empire. Chapter 1. A Corsican Heart, 1769 to 1789. On August 15, 1769, as the Mediterranean sun baked the cobblestones of Ajaccio, a baby's first cry pierced the thick summer air. The child who would one day rule Europe entered the world on a feast day, the Assumption of Mary, in a house that smelled of sea salt and wild herbs. His mother, Letizia Romolino Bonaparte, had attended Mass that morning despite being in labor. The Corsicans would later whisper that she barely made it home in time, giving birth on a carpet decorated with scenes from Homer's *Iliad*. It was a fitting entrance for a future conqueror, though no one that day could have imagined the destiny that awaited little Napoleon Bonaparte. The Corsica of Napoleon's birth was a land of blood feuds and ancient honor, where vendettas could last generations and loyalty to family trumped all other concerns. Just 14 months earlier, the island had lost its brief taste of independence to French rule, a fact that would shape young Napoleon's worldview in ways both subtle and profound. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, had fought alongside the Corsican patriot Pasquale Paoli in the failed struggle for independence. Yet Carlo was also a pragmatist who quickly aligned himself with the French victors, securing his family's position in the new order. This early lesson in political survival would not be lost on his second son. The Bonaparte household was a crucible of ambition and necessity. Letizia, whom Napoleon would later call a man's head on a woman's body, managed their perpetually stretched finances with iron discipline. She was barely 30 when she bore 13 children, 8 of whom survived infancy. Young Napoleon watched as she commanded the household with military precision, dispensing both love and discipline with calculated efficiency. "It is to my mother," he would later reflect, "to her good principles that I owe my fortune and all I have done that is worthwhile." In the narrow streets of Ajaccio, young Napoleon was known as a solitary, intense child. While other boys played at soldiers, he organized them into armies, already displaying the tactical mind that would later reshape warfare. His early playmates remembered him as both charismatic and domineering, capable of inspiring fierce loyalty while brooking no challenge to his authority. He spent hours in his father's library devouring histories of great conquerors, Alexander, Caesar, Charlemagne. The walls of that room, with their maps of distant lands and portraits of ancient heroes, became the first boundaries he dreamed of crossing. Carlo Bonaparte's political maneuvering eventually won his second son a prestigious scholarship to the military academy at Brienne in mainland France. For the 9-year-old Napoleon, the journey across the Mediterranean in 1778 marked his first exile, a separation from his beloved Corsica that would forge both his strength and his permanent sense of being an outsider. The young Corsican arrived at Brienne speaking barely a word of French, his Italian accent thick as olive oil. His classmates, sons of noble French families, mocked his origins, his accent, even his name, which they couldn't pronounce. They called him La Paille au Nez, straw nose, a French play on his name that made him seethe with rage. But Napoleon did what he would do throughout his life. He turned disadvantage into opportunity. While other boys slept or played, he studied. While they socialized, he read. His mathematical genius quickly became apparent, and he excelled in geography and history, subjects that would serve him well in his future campaigns. The priests who ran Brienne noted his brooding ambition and imperious temper. One instructor wrote that young Bonaparte was distinguished in mathematical studies, tolerably versed in history and geography, much behind in Latin and belles lettres and other accomplishments of regular habits, studious and well-behaved. What this dry assessment missed was the volcano of ambition building beneath the surface. Napoleon was learning not just military tactics, but the ways of his future subjects, their habits, their vanities, their weaknesses. He was, in effect, conducting reconnaissance on the society he would one day rule. Yet even as he mastered the French language and customs, Napoleon remained fundamentally Corsican. In his letters home, passionate, detailed missives that revealed his growing literary skill, he dreamed of liberating his homeland. He devoured Corsican history and wrote fervent essays about independence. This duality would mark his entire life: the outsider who conquered from within, the revolutionary who became an emperor, the liberator who turned conqueror. His father's death in 1785, when Napoleon was 15, forced him to grow up quickly. As the de facto head of the family, his older brother Joseph being less decisive, he began juggling family responsibilities with his military studies. The experience taught him another crucial lesson. Power meant nothing without the practical ability to provide for those under one's protection. By 1789, when revolution began shaking France to its foundations, the young artillery Lieutenant Bonaparte was ready. He had learned to turn resentment into ambition, to transform opposition into opportunity. He had mastered the art of being simultaneously inside and outside the system he would one day overthrow. Most crucially, he had developed the capacity to see beyond the immediate horizon to distant possibilities that others couldn't imagine. The wild island of his birth had given him an outsider's hunger and a conqueror's vision. The military schools of France had given him the tools to realize that vision. Now, as the old order began to crumble, Lieutenant Bonaparte stood ready to seize his destiny. The revolution would provide his opportunity, but first he would have to survive it. In the years to come, he would transform himself from Napoleon Bonaparte, the Corsican patriot, into Napoleon Bonaparte, the French revolutionary, and finally into Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French. But in his heart, he would always remain that fierce island child, fighting to prove himself against a world that underestimated him. Impossible, he would later say, is a word only to be found in the Dictionary of Fools. Chapter 2, Seizing Destiny, 1789 to 1799. On the morning of July 14, 1789, Lieutenant Bonaparte was writing reports in his garrison at Ozon when he heard the news. Paris had exploded. The Bastille, that ancient symbol of royal authority, had fallen to a mob of citizens armed with fury and makeshift weapons. The young artillery officer paused at his desk, his quill suspended above the paper. "So it begins," he wrote to his brother Joseph. "Who can say where it will end?" Napoleon was 20 years old when the revolution began, and like many ambitious young men of his generation, he saw in the collapse of the old order both opportunity and danger. While other officers from noble families fled France for the safety of exile, Bonaparte calculated his odds with the cold precision that would later serve him on the battlefield. He had nothing to lose from the fall of the aristocracy and everything to gain from a system that rewarded merit over birth. Yet the revolution's early years tested even his remarkable ability to navigate chaos. In Corsica, where he spent much of 1789 to 1792, he played a dangerous game of political triangulation. To the French revolutionaries, he presented himself as a patriotic officer, loyal to the new order. To his fellow Corsicans, he posed as a nationalist in the mold of his old hero Pasquale Paoli. He wrote inflammatory articles for revolutionary newspapers, organized local militias, and somehow managed to be everywhere and nowhere when blood was shed. The death of Louis XVI in January 1793 forced everyone in France to choose sides. Bonaparte, watching the king's head fall into the basket, understood that there would be no going back to the old ways. "The revolution," he told a friend, "is like the Nile in flood. No one can resist it." His calculations proved correct. While many of his fellow officers lost their heads to the guillotine, Napoleon's obvious talent and carefully cultivated revolutionary credentials saw him promoted to artillery commander at the Siege of Toulon in 1793. It was at Toulon that the world got its first glimpse of the military genius that would reshape Europe. The city had declared for the British and seemed impregnable. Traditional military doctrine called for a lengthy siege. But the young artillery commander saw what others missed. A promontory called Les Guillettes that, if captured, would allow his guns to dominate the harbor. In a series of brilliant maneuvers that combined technical expertise with sheer audacity, Bonaparte's batteries forced the British fleet to evacuate, leaving the city to its fate. The victory at Toulon catapulted him into the revolution's inner circle. Suddenly, the awkward Corsican was dining with Robespierre's younger brother and catching the eye of powerful patrons. Yet this proximity to power nearly proved fatal when Robespierre fell in the Thermidorian reaction of 1794. Bonaparte spent 2 weeks under arrest, his career and life hanging by a thread. It was his first taste of how quickly political fortunes could reverse, a lesson he never forgot. But Napoleon had developed an almost supernatural ability to land on his feet. Released from prison, he found himself in Paris just as the Directory was establishing its shaky rule. The capital of 1795 was a city of stark contrasts, glittering salons where newly rich speculators danced all night, while in the streets, people fought over loaves of bread. It was in these salons that Napoleon met the woman who would change his life, Josephine de Beauharnais, 6 years his senior and a survivor of the terror that had claimed her first husband. Their courtship was a whirlwind of passion and calculation. Josephine saw in the intense young general a rising star who could secure her position in uncertain times. Napoleon, desperately in love, also recognized that her social connections could advance his career. Their letters scorched the paper. "I awake full of you," he wrote. "Your portrait and the intoxicating evening yesterday have left my senses in turmoil." They married on March 9th, 1796, 2 days before he left to take command of the Army of Italy. The Italian campaign of 1796 to 97 revealed Napoleon in full flower. Here was the complete package: military genius, political acumen, and an understanding of propaganda that was ahead of its time. He didn't just win battles, he created a legend. His proclamations to his troops read like poetry. "Soldiers, you are badly fed and almost naked. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces, great cities will be in your power. There you will find honor, glory, and riches." He delivered on these promises in a campaign that still dazzles military historians. At Lodi, he earned the nickname the Little Corporal by personally directing artillery fire under enemy fire. At Arcole, he seized a flag and led a charge across a bridge while bullets whistled past. Each victory was promptly reported to Paris in dispatches that combined factual achievement with brilliant self-promotion. Napoleon understood that in revolutionary France, perception was power. By 1799, he had become too big for Italy, too big even for an expedition to Egypt, where he won battles while losing his fleet to Nelson at the Battle of the Nile. France, suffering under the corrupt and ineffective Directory, seemed to be crying out for a savior. On 18 Brumaire, November 9, 1799, Napoleon answered that call. In a complex coup that combined political manipulation with the threat of military force, he and his allies overthrew the Directory. Standing before the Council of 500, facing angry deputies who branded him an outlaw, Napoleon kept his nerve. When his brother Lucien, president of the council, dramatically drew his sword and swore to kill his own brother if he ever became a tyrant, the deputies were won over. The Republic was transformed into the consulate, with Napoleon as first consul. Democracy's twilight had arrived, ushered in by a man who claimed to be its savior. That evening, in the Luxembourg Palace, the new first consul sat at his desk until dawn, already planning the reconstruction of France. He was 30 years old. In a decade, he had risen from an obscure lieutenant to the most powerful man in France. Yet this was only the beginning. "I have tasted command," he wrote to Josephine that night, "and I cannot give it up." The revolution had created the conditions for his rise, but Napoleon's genius lay in understanding how to transcend it. He would preserve its gains while ending its chaos, guarantee its rights while limiting its freedoms. He would, in short, create a new synthesis that would transform not just France, but all of Europe. The age of Napoleon had begun. Chapter 3. The Eagle Ascendant, 1800 to 1807. "What is a throne?" Napoleon once mused to his secretary. "A piece of wood gilded and covered in velvet. I am the state. I alone am here, the representative of the people. Even if I had done wrong, you shouldn't have reproached me publicly. People wash their dirty linen at home." In this characteristic outburst, we see both the brilliance and the blindness of Napoleon at his height. The revolutionary who had become an autocrat, the outsider who had become the establishment, the general who would soon be emperor. The France that Napoleon inherited as first consul was a nation exhausted by revolution and war. The treasury was empty, the roads were infested with bandits, and the provinces were torn by religious strife. With characteristic energy, he attacked these problems simultaneously. "The revolution is over," he declared. "I am the revolution." It was more than mere bombast. It was a promise to preserve the revolution's gains while ending its chaos. His first miracle was administrative. Working 20-hour days, fueled by strong coffee and ambition, he reorganized every aspect of French government. New prefects were appointed to manage the departments, chosen for competence rather than connections. The tax system was rationalized, a central bank was established, and roads were rebuilt. Education was reorganized on merit rather than privilege. Even the church was brought to heel through a concordat with the Pope that healed the revolutionary schism while maintaining state control. But Napoleon's masterpiece was the Civil Code, later known as the Code Napoleon. In marathon sessions, he personally presided over the debates that would create a unified legal system for France. His practical intelligence cut through centuries of accumulated legal complexity. When his lawyers presented him with dense technical language, he insisted on clarity. Write it so that every citizen can understand it. The Code embodied revolutionary principles of equality before the law while protecting property rights and paternal authority. It would outlast his empire, spreading across Europe and influencing legal systems from Louisiana to Japan. Yet even as he built, Napoleon faced constant threats. In 1800, royalist agents tried to kill him with an explosives-laden cart on the Rue Saint-Nicaise. He survived by seconds thanks to his coachman's drunk driving. His response was swift and terrible. Dozens of suspects were arrested, and several were executed, though many were probably innocent. The incident hardened something in him. "I am the state," he began to say more frequently. The Peace of Amiens in 1802 brought a brief respite from war with Britain. Napoleon used this breathing space to consolidate his power. When the Senate offered him the consulship for life, he accepted with false modesty, staging a plebiscite that overwhelmingly approved the change. It was democracy theater. No one dared vote against him, but it gave him the veneer of popular legitimacy he craved. The transformation from first consul to emperor in 1804 was the logical next step. The coronation ceremony at Notre Dame was a masterpiece of political theater. When Napoleon took the crown from Pope Pius VII's hands and placed it on his own head, he was making a statement. Power came not from God or tradition, but from his own will and ability. Then, in a gesture that moved many observers, he crowned Josephine himself, the former colonial planter's daughter, now an empress. But it was on the battlefield that Napoleon truly earned his crown. The Battle of Austerlitz in 1805 was his masterpiece, a symphony of maneuver and deception that destroyed the combined armies of Austria and Russia. Fighting in the winter fog, he deliberately weakened his right flank, tempting the Allies to attack. When they took the bait, he launched a devastating counterattack that split their army in two. By day's end, the Third Coalition lay in ruins, and Napoleon stood as the undisputed master of continental Europe. The years 1806 to 1807 marked his zenith. Prussia was crushed at Jena and Austerlitz. Russia, after the bloody draw at Eylau, was decisively beaten at Friedland. At Tilsit, Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I met on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River to divide Europe between them. The scene was heavy with symbolism. Two emperors, one born to the purple and one self-made, redrawing the map of a continent. Yet even at this peak, the seeds of disaster were being sown. The continental system, his grand scheme to strangle British trade, was creating economic hardship across Europe. The occupation of Spain was turning into a quagmire, and Napoleon himself was changing. The lean, ambitious general was becoming the corpulent emperor, more willing to trust in his star than in careful preparation. His personal life reflected these changes. His marriage to Josephine, though passionate, had produced no heir. Despite their deep attachment, he began to consider divorce. The empire he had built needed a dynasty to survive, and for that, he needed a son. It was the supreme irony. The man who had risen through merit was now trapped by the very royal traditions he had once despised. By 1807, Napoleon had achieved what no ruler since Charlemagne had managed: hegemony over Europe. His family sat on thrones from Spain to Naples. The Code Napoleon was becoming the law of a continent. French culture and administration were reshaping societies from the Atlantic to the Vistula. He had in just 7 years created what would later be called the First Europe. Yet standing at the summit of his power, Napoleon could not see that he had climbed as high as destiny would allow. The qualities that had brought him there, his relentless ambition, his belief in his star, his inability to accept limits, would soon lead him to overreach. The eagle had soared to unprecedented heights, but like Icarus, he was flying too close to the sun. Looking back at his coronation years later, Napoleon would remark, "I found the crown of France lying in the gutter, and I picked it up with my sword." It was a characteristic mix of truth and self-mythology. He had indeed rescued France from chaos and raised her to unprecedented glory. But in doing so, he had created an empire that could exist only through constant victory and expansion, a machine that would destroy itself if it ever stopped moving forward. Chapter 4. Hubris, 1808 to 1812. "Power is my mistress," Napoleon once told his minister Roederer. "I have done too much for her conquest to allow anyone to take her from me." By 1808, that mistress had become a demanding one indeed. The emperor who had once been the liberator of Europe was becoming its jailer, and the costs of maintaining his growing empire were beginning to exceed even his extraordinary capabilities. The first cracks appeared in Spain. What began as a cynical power grab, installing his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, turned into what Napoleon would later call the Spanish ulcer. The Spanish people, far from welcoming French control, erupted in savage rebellion. Ordinary citizens armed with kitchen knives attacked French soldiers in the streets of Madrid. The painter Goya captured the horror in his masterpiece, the 3rd of May 1808, showing French troops executing Spanish patriots under cover of darkness. Napoleon's response revealed how far he had traveled from his revolutionary origins. "I will make such an example that the people of Madrid will remember it for 100 years, he declared. But brute force, which had served him so well on the battlefield, proved useless against this new kind of warfare. Every atrocity bred new guerrillas, every execution created new martyrs. For the first time, Napoleon faced an enemy he couldn't defeat because he couldn't understand it: popular nationalism, the very force he had once embodied. Even his personal life became subordinated to imperial necessity. Despite their deep attachment, Napoleon divorced Josephine in 1809. The ceremony was a portrait in painful dignity. Both wept as they read their statements of mutual consent. That night, Napoleon locked himself in his room, while Josephine's sobs echoed through the palace corridors. When servants finally forced his door the next morning, fearing the worst, they found him fully dressed on his bed, staring at the ceiling, clutching Josephine's miniature portrait. His marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria was meant to cement his dynasty and gain acceptance among Europe's royal families. The 18-year-old Habsburg Archduchess was everything Josephine wasn't: young, fertile, and of impeccable royal blood. When she gave birth to a son in 1811, the long-desired heir whom Napoleon styled the King of Rome, it seemed the future of the dynasty was secure. Yet there was something almost Greek in how this apparent triumph contained the seeds of disaster. The continental system, Napoleon's grand scheme to strangle British trade, was slowly strangling Europe instead. In Amsterdam, warehouses rotted with unsold goods. In Hamburg, merchants went bankrupt. Coffee became scarce, sugar prices soared, and smuggling became the continent's growth industry. When Napoleon's own brother Louis, installed as King of Holland, refused to enforce the blockade because it was ruining his adopted country, Napoleon simply annexed Holland to France. This pattern of responding to every problem by tightening control to every failure with more force reached its apex in his relations with Russia. Tsar Alexander Bremen, once charmed by Napoleon at Tilsit, was growing restive. Russian nobles grumbled about the continental system's effects on their ability to sell grain to Britain. French spies reported Russian troops moving westward. Napoleon's response was characteristic. If Russia wouldn't submit to his will, he would force it to do so. The planning for the Russian campaign revealed how Napoleon's greatest strengths had become weaknesses. His legendary attention to detail now manifested as micromanagement. His confidence had hardened into arrogance. When his most trusted advisors urged caution, he dismissed them. "I must do the impossible to succeed," he declared. "Therefore, I will succeed." The Grande Armée that crossed the Niemen River on June 24, 1812, was the largest and most diverse European army ever assembled. 680,000 men speaking a dozen languages, accompanied by 1,000 cannons and 150,000 horses. Napoleon's supply officers had calculated everything down to the last button, except the vastness of Russia itself. As the army advanced, Russia retreated. Villages were burned, wells poisoned, crops destroyed. Napoleon had expected a decisive battle near the border, but the Russians kept withdrawing, drawing him deeper into their empire. By the time he reached Smolensk in August, he had already lost 150,000 men to disease, desertion, and the grinding logistics of moving such a massive force. The Battle of Borodino on September 7th was the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. The French won a tactical victory but failed to destroy the Russian army. A week later, Napoleon entered Moscow, expecting to receive Russia's surrender. Instead, he found a ghost town. That night, fires broke out across the city. Within days, Moscow was an inferno. Napoleon waited 5 weeks in the burned-out shell of the Kremlin, hoping for a peace offer that never came. The retreat began on October 19th, too late to escape the Russian winter. What followed was apocalyptic. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees. Horses died by the thousands, forcing the abandonment of artillery and supply wagons. Men froze to death in their sleep or straggled behind to be killed by Cossacks. The once magnificent army dissolved into a mass of starving refugees. Napoleon himself rode ahead in a fur-lined sleigh, leaving Marshal Ney to command the rearguard. His bulletin to Paris, dictated during the retreat, became famous for its masterpiece of understatement. The horses were badly shod for ice. "The cold took our horses by thousands. The army is in need of re-establishing its discipline and refreshing itself." Of the 680,000 men who had entered Russia, fewer than 100,000 returned. Napoleon had finally found something he couldn't defeat: geography itself. His personality, the relentless drive that had carried him so far, had led him into a trap from which even his genius couldn't escape. Back in Paris, news of the disaster sparked the first serious questions about Napoleon's judgment. A bizarre attempted coup by General Mallet, who had spread a false report of Napoleon's death, revealed how dependent the entire imperial system was on one man. More ominously, it showed how quickly people were prepared to believe in his demise. The Russia campaign marked the end of Napoleon's infallibility. He would win more battles and show flashes of his old genius, but he would never again command the aura of invincibility that had been as much a weapon as his artillery. His mistress power had betrayed him, and Europe, sensing weakness, began to stir. The year 1813 would bring new coalitions, new battles, and the beginning of the end. Looking at a map years later on St. Helena, Napoleon's finger traced the long road to Moscow. "I failed," he said simply. "I thought I could be stronger than nature itself." It was perhaps his most profound insight, the recognition that even the greatest human will must ultimately bow to forces beyond its control. Chapter 4. Hubris, 1808 to 18... Chapter 5. Downfall, 1813 to 1815. Great misfortunes always unveil base souls and elevate great ones, Napoleon wrote in early 1813, as he watched his empire begin to crumble. It was a sentiment he would have ample opportunity to test in the months ahead. The disaster in Russia had stripped away his aura of invincibility, and all across Europe, the ground was shifting beneath his feet. For years, the Prussians had nursed their humiliation from Jena, rebuilding their army in secret while pretending submission. Now they openly defected to Russia. Austria, ruled by Napoleon's own father-in-law, played a more subtle game, offering to mediate while secretly arming for war. In palaces and chancelleries across Europe, diplomats who had once trembled at Napoleon's name began to whisper of vulnerability. Yet even in decline, Napoleon remained formidable. In 4 months, he raised a new army of 350,000 men, though these were largely raw recruits. Marie-Louises, as the veterans mockingly called them after his young empress. When he appeared at the Battle of Lutzen in May 1813, leading these boys against the combined Prussian and Russian armies, it seemed the old magic might still work. The French won the field, but something had changed. The victories were no longer decisive, the enemies no longer broke and ran. The Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, the Battle of Nations, marked the death knell of French hegemony in Europe. For 4 days, 500,000 men struggled in the largest battle Europe had seen since classical times. Napoleon's military genius flickered one last time as he moved his outnumbered forces to meet threats from every direction. But there were too many enemies, too few veterans, too much territory to defend. When the Saxons, longtime allies, defected in the middle of the battle, the writing was on the wall. Napoleon ordered a retreat that became a rout when the only bridge over the Elster River was blown up too early, stranding 30,000 men. The campaign of 1814 showed Napoleon at his tactical, brilliant best, even as strategic victories slipped away. Defending France with a dramatically outnumbered army, he darted between advancing Allied columns, striking where least expected. "The Emperor has been here!" became the terrified cry of Allied commanders finding their carefully laid plans in ruins. In 6 weeks, he won more victories than in the previous 2 years. But while he defeated armies, Paris fell. The defection of Talleyrand and Marmont, men he had raised to prominence, cut deeper than any military defeat. The silk stockings filled with shit, he called them with characteristic vulgarity. But their betrayal reflected a broader truth. France was exhausted. When Napoleon reached Fontainebleau on April 4, 1814, he found himself increasingly alone. His marshals, once competing for his favor, now avoided his eyes. Finally, Ney spoke for them all. "Sire, it's time to think of something else. The army will not march on Paris." The abdication scene was pure theater. Napoleon attempted suicide with a poison he had carried since Russia, only to discover that time had weakened the dose. He survived to stage manage his own fall, choosing Elba as his place of exile, an island kingdom for a reduced emperor. His farewell to the old guard in the courtyard of Fontainebleau became an instant legend. Kissing the eagle on their battle flag, he declared, "I cannot embrace you all, but I embrace your general. Farewell, my children." Elba proved too small a stage for such a personality. While the Congress of Vienna redrew the map of Europe, Napoleon plotted his return. On February 26, 1815, he slipped away from his British watchers with 1,000 men. Landing near Cannes, he began the most audacious gamble of his career. The story of his march on Paris became legend. Near Grenoble, he confronted a regiment sent to arrest him. Stepping forward alone, he opened his famous grey coat. "If any of you would shoot your emperor, here I am." The soldiers broke ranks to embrace him. Each confrontation ended the same way. The armies sent to stop him became his escort. Marshal Ney, who had promised Louis XVI to bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, ended up joining him with tears of joy. The 100 days that followed were like a fever dream, a compressed replay of his entire career. He tried to present himself as a changed man, a constitutional monarch who had learned from exile. But the Allies weren't interested in negotiations. "It is Napoleon who is the sole obstacle to peace," they declared. Once again, Europe mobilized against him. The campaign that followed was vintage Napoleon: swift movement, attempted concentration against isolated enemies. But at Waterloo on June 18, 1815, the luck that had sustained him through 1,000 battles finally ran out. The rain that delayed his attack, Ney's premature cavalry charges, the arrival of Blücher's Prussians, every chance went against him. By evening, the last square of the Old Guard was breaking under Wellington's pressure, and Napoleon had to be led from the field, muttering, "All is lost." His second abdication sparked no drama. Paris, twice bitten, was shy of Bonapartist fever. When he fled to Rochefort, hoping to escape to America, he found British warships waiting. With characteristic flair for the dramatic, he wrote to the Prince Regent, "Like Themistocles, I come to seek the hospitality of the British people." The response was exile to St. Helena, a volcanic rock in the South Atlantic, far from anywhere he might cause trouble. The 6 years of his final exile formed a coda to his extraordinary life. He spent them dictating his memoirs, arguing with his British jailers, and crafting the legend that would long outlive him. His conversations, recorded by his followers, showed flashes of the old brilliance mixed with self-justification and selective memory. "What a novel my life has been!" he exclaimed near the end. He died on May 5, 1821, during a storm that recalled the wild weather of his Corsican youth. His last coherent words were France, "Armée, tête d'armée, Joséphine." Even in death, his thoughts returned to the twin poles of his existence, military glory and lost love. They buried him on St. Helena in a nameless grave, though his final wish, to rest on the banks of the Seine, among the French people I have loved so much, would eventually be granted. In 1840, his remains were returned to Paris, where they still rest under the dome of Les Invalides. Napoleon's legacy defies easy summary. He spread the ideals of the French Revolution across Europe, even while betraying them in France. He modernized administration and law, even while restricting freedom. He championed merit over birth, even while founding his own dynasty. Perhaps his true legacy lies not in what he did, but in what he represented: the capacity of a single human will to reshape the world for better and worse. "Impossible," he once said, "is a word only to be found in the dictionary of fools." His life proved both the truth and the danger of that conviction. In the end, Napoleon's greatest enemy was not the coalition, not winter, not even the British. It was the impossible itself, which turned out to exist after